Hello and welcome to the Forum's podcast. My name is Hind Al-Ansari, and I'm thrilled to be your host in this exciting new project by the Gulf International Forum. This is a new venture for the Forum, and I'm eager to dive into today's discussion as well as the future topics with our esteemed guests. Today's topic holds a significant implication for both the United States and the Arab Gulf states, namely the intersection of U.S. foreign policy, the oil economy, and the upcoming U.S. elections. These are critical areas where the intersections of the GCC and the US align, diverge, and sometimes even clash, especially in the context of global energy markets and geopolitical strategy. To help us navigate these complex dynamics, we are joined by a distinguished guest, Dr. Kristian Ulrichsen. Dr. Ulrichsen is a fellow for the Middle East at the Baker Institute and co director of the Middle East Energy Roundtable. His research offers profound insights into the evolving role of the Persian Gulf states in the global order, as well as the emergence of long term, non military challenges to regional security. Dr. Ulrichsen has an extensive background in Gulf studies, having previously served as a senior Gulf analyst at the Gulf Center for Strategic Studies and as co director of the Kuwait Program on Development, Governance, and Globalization in the Gulf states at the London School of Economics. He has authored numerous influential publications on the region, including The Gulf States in International Political Economy, Qatar and the Gulf Crisis, and most recently, Centers of Power in the Arab Gulf States. Dr. Ulrichsen, thank you so much for joining us here today. Let's begin by exploring how the upcoming US elections might influence the GCC's relationship with the United States and the broader implications for the region's oil economy.
Well, thank you very much for having me and for having me as a first guest on the podcast. It's an honor. It's a very good time also to begin a podcast such as this, given the significance of the upcoming US elections, knowing, of course, what happened the last time that Donald Trump was running to become president of the US in 2016. And of course, that then led to a period of profound political turmoil, not only for the US, but also for US Gulf relations and also for intra Gulf relations within the GCC with the blockade of Qatar between 2017 and the end of 2020, which was, of course, resolved during the transition away from Trump to Biden in January 2021, the day before the January 6th riots at Capitol in Washington, D.C. So I think it's only natural that people in the Gulf, around the world, are looking very closely at this election to see what it may mean for not only for the US, but for their interests and their positions as well. And of course, I think assumptions had been very much that Trump was probably going to win as long as Joe Biden was still his opponent. And over the past 6 weeks since Biden pulled out on the 21st of July, those assumptions have had to be reassessed just because Kamala Harris has really injected a huge note of enthusiasm into the Democratic campaign. So with that in mind, I suspect that officials up and down the Gulf are now looking at Harris, who has less of a foreign policy record than Biden did. And Biden, of course, was involved in foreign policy for more than 40 years in the Senate and then as vice president. And probably trying to think about what it means for US Gulf relations going forward, because we've had a period of uncertainty spanning 3 different presidents, Obama, Trump, and Biden, where I think the mood in the Gulf is very much we don't quite know if the US is a reliable long-term partner. Where is the US going to be in 10 years? We've seen these wild swings in US policymaking. And to some extent, one area where the left and the right in the US both agree on is trying to disengage from large parts of the world. So what does this mean for us? So I think these are all questions that will be dominant in the to this point in time.
You definitely hit the nail on the head when you talked about whether the US is a reliable ally or not. And in more recent years, we've seen the shifts in US foreign policy priorities, particularly from the GCC, particularly with a focus on Asia. I mean, we have Saudi Arabia strengthening its relationship with China, and maybe a little bit less so with the other GCC states, but there is still a path towards that. So, could you elaborate a little bit more about the perception of the GCC states on alliance with Asia? Maybe a little bit, I don't want to say the word foregoing necessarily, foregoing its relationship with the US. That's still a big word to use, but at least in terms of their own strategies moving forward, especially with the new elections coming up.
Yes, if you remember back in about 2010 in the Obama administration, there was this phrase, the pivot to Asia, which seemed to encapsulate a feeling in the Gulf and the Middle East more generally that we, the Middle East, were being abandoned, that the US was shifting focus to the Pacific as the main area in which 21st century geopolitics would play out. And it seemed to encapsulate in three words, pivot to Asia, everything that people weren't quite sure about the Obama administration. Now, the irony was that from a US perspective, the pivot wasn't a pivot away from the Middle East, it was a pivot away from Europe, from
Yes.
an idea that post World War II, it no longer made sense post Cold War to continue to station large numbers of US forces and bases in a unified European Union. Now, that didn't come through in terms of the perception. And as you say, perception is important because it often drives the way people see things and often can become then a reality. So the pivot was never seen as a pivot away from the Middle East, but it was never quite spelled out in those terms. And arguably, here we are in 2024, and of course, the European situation is now, with the Ukraine war now more than 2.5 years old, arguably the pivot has been back to Europe. It's been back to Europe in terms of US policy focus. So now it could be that there's a lessening of interest in the Middle East, although, of course, over the last year with the situation in Gaza, we've seen completely different pressures now being put on US positioning in the region. The pivot to Asia was also a little bit interesting because the Gulf states have pivoted to Asia too, in a sense that if you look at the direction of energy exports, oil and gas, a lot of it now goes east. For the Gulf states, Asia and the big Asian economies are now the identified partners of the 21st century. So, in a sense, the feeling was that the Gulf states have already pivoted in terms of their economic and energy relationships, looking forward, looking to mid-century to 2050 and beyond. And so when the US was talking about pivoting, it seemed to be almost perceived as a slight when officials, certainly in the UAE and Saudi, were doing the same thing. So again, we see maybe a mismatch in perceptions. But I think certainly from a Gulf point of view, the Asian markets, the Asian economies, they're very much the future. And of course, geographical proximity makes sense. I mean, the Gulf is very strategically located. The sort of intersection of Africa, Asia, close to Europe, it makes sense for the Gulf states to look east, just as you might argue it makes sense for the US to look west, to look to the Pacific. So I think maybe just because it had been a shift away from maybe the previous 20 years where the US had been so heavily involved in the Middle East with the Gulf states being essential logistical and administrative points for the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, it meant that a drawdown of US forces from those artificially high levels perhaps was seen as almost a sort of disengagement, when in fact maybe it was more of a return to a long-term sort of normality where you have numbers of US forces in the Gulf, but not the numbers we saw after 2003.
Very interesting. And Dr. Ulrichsen, a lot of your research also focuses on oil economy. And of course, oil economy plays a very pivotal role in the aspects that we're discussing right now. So typically speaking, how do you think the shifts in US energy policy, such as the potential to move towards greater energy independence or renewable energy, might affect the Gulf economies and their geopolitical strategies moving forward?
Well, I think the big shift over the past 15, 20 years has been that the US has become one of the biggest producers of oil once again, and is now exporting energy as well. And that wasn't necessarily something that had been predicted. And so the US is now a major player in the fossil fuel sector, even if many politicians in DC who are talking about energy transitions would rather perhaps this wasn't the case, but it is, and it's a reality. And we saw in 2020, for example, when Saudi Arabia and Russia began their oil price dispute just at the time that the pandemic really took hold and oil prices crashed to below zero for a time in futures markets. We saw then just how there was this furious backlash in the US, especially among Republican politicians in oil and gas producing states. So we see still how the US is a major producer and is really heavily engaged, invested in the long-term future of oil and gas in ways that perhaps we don't always see in the media, which focuses on net zero and on the transitions. Now, from a Gulf point of view, given that oil and gas is still so heavily important, obviously the energy transition looks different from Kuwait or from Saudi Arabia than it does from European capitals. And so at some point, there will have to be maybe a balance that can be struck between the interests of oil and gas producers and then the interests, of course, of consumers and of others. And I'm not sure that this balance has yet been identified. And perhaps it might make more sense to think of different transitions at different speeds. And of course, for a country like Qatar, which is perhaps fortuitous in the sense that gas and LNG is in many ways, so the Qataris themselves like to call it a kind of a bridging fuel. It's it's less dirty in a sense than oil, certainly less dirty than coal, and can be the sort of fuel that can get through until there's a meaningful alternative. And I suspect there won't be ever a real alternative, a kind of full alternative to oil and gas. And certainly the Saudi point, I think, is that there'll always be a residual demand for oil. And from our point of view, the Saudi point of view, that demand, that oil will probably come from the Gulf because it's still cheaper and easier to produce and arguably produces less emissions in doing so. So there'll always be a residual demand for oil and gas, or from oil, especially from the Gulf. I guess the question is, will it still have value? And of course, Gulf states don't make money by producing oil, they make it by selling it on international markets. So if there's no value in that demand, that's where the challenge will lie. And so one could argue that with the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, oil and gas prices, oil prices especially, they spiked, and Saudi Arabia reported record revenues in 2022. I mean, will we look back in 15 or 20 years' time and think that this period post 2022 was the last great oil price boom, was the last great windfall, or will it just be cyclical where things react to events? So it's probably hard to tell, but certainly when you were looking at it in 2020, 21 during the pandemic and oil prices were very low, suddenly to have a period of higher prices could arguably give governments in the Gulf the ability to then shift revenues into investment funds to try and invest in cleaner and other forms of energy, or in terms of trying to diversify the revenue stream by developing alternative sources of income through returns on investment. I mean, I think we're seeing that, especially with the UAE and to some extent with the public investment fund in Saudi Arabia, although again, they're becoming much more of a domestic focused fund as well. So we are seeing movement in terms of trying to diversify sources of income and sources of industry away from oil, but there's obviously still a long way to go.
Absolutely. One of the things that I do talk about in my own research is this shift to knowledge based economies, where they're preparing the younger generations and the future generations to rely less on, probably like the public sector in which they can access certain resources provided by the government, high benefits, financial and not. But at the same time, as you said, like we still have a long way to go. In addition to the current oil sector, energy sector, where do you think that perhaps one of the sectors currently that are taking off, moving in the shift in the knowledge based economy, that seem to be doing pretty well currently? Is it probably in the realm of entrepreneurship? Is it in real estate? Is it in tourism? What should be looking at right now that would make us a bit more optimistic about non oil based economies moving forward?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing about the knowledge-based economy transitions that we've seen that have worked, like for example, in South Korea, is that they took place over 30 or 40 years. It wasn't instantaneous. And I think maybe a criticism of the Gulf in the past has been that perhaps governments would invest in building a university or something and thinking we've cracked the knowledge-based economy. But of course, this takes generations. It takes sustained change. And took South Korea 30 or 40 years, but they've done it and they've been very successful. I think AI is clearly something that has been identified, especially in the UAE. The UAE is trying to position itself as at the forefront of the next kind of set of major economic shifts, focusing on tech, clean tech. Probably no coincidence that the big focus of the Dubai climate change conference last year wasn't phasing out fossil fuels, but focusing on clean tech and trying to drive emissions down. So I think they're making big bets on the technologies of the future, which will allow them to be at the cutting edge of the fourth industrial revolution, as they would say. And of course, the huge amounts of resources in investment funds in the Gulf mean that they can actually throw massive amounts of research and development funding at these issues in ways perhaps that we don't see in funding streams in the West. So there is an opportunity perhaps in tech to be at the forefront of the next generation of change. Now, the challenge there perhaps will be, will it create sufficient numbers of new jobs to replace sort of public sector employment, as you said, which has historically been the main sort of absorber of labor market entrance in the Gulf, or will it just create a new sort of set of elite workers, many of whom may not even be Gulf citizens, and create a different set of problems down the line? I mean, something will have to create those tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of new jobs for, again, the sort of generation of incredibly highly qualified, highly educated young people coming onto the labor markets, which is an opportunity, but also clearly a challenge too.
Absolutely. And with the changes implemented by these governments in the GCC, I mean, you talked about the reforms in education, sending people to the West, bringing in satellite campuses from the West. In Qatar, we have Education City. In Saudi Arabia, there are multiple British universities that are creating their own base over there. Even in the UAE, we have New York University. And typically speaking, when you're expanding educational opportunities, and you're involving the younger generations in different sectors in which they feel empowered, for the future, more specifically, of course, people are going to have more demands in terms of what they think should be best for the economy, or what they think should be best in terms of, politics looking from the inside. So do you see any kind of like new directions in terms of civic engagement? And even with civic engagement, a lot of people are also talking about the GCC relationship with the U.S. I mean, people are a lot more outspoken nowadays than they were before, especially with the fact that we have social media networks allowing us to do that. So, have you noticed any kind of trends or shifts in public opinion or public sentiment when it comes to GCC relationship with the U.S. and the West in general?
Well, I think people, as you say, with social media are much more, not only much more informed and much more, more able now to also get news that is completely unfiltered, which perhaps is a problem too, as we're seeing with Twitter under Elon Musk. but certainly there's an ability to access information in real time, which may or may not be true, and then to comment on it. And we are seeing in a country like Saudi Arabia, for example, we're seeing people run the risk of falling foul of the authorities in terms of being sentenced to long terms in prison for not even just tweeting, but for liking tweets as well. So again, we're seeing perhaps these two different trends at the same time. Governments trying to keep control of the flow of information, or at least the flow of discussion, but then people across the region having access to kind of streams of information in real time, and the ability and the desire to comment. And of course, when we see things happening which enrage people, which get people on all sides very heavily involved emotionally, as of course we've seen with Gaza, for example, then we do see a lot of comments that are very critical of the US, and rightly so, in my view. And it's been fascinating for me from the outside just to be watching, for example, in Oman. Oman, historically, a country that keeps a low profile in terms of foreign policy and regional policy, tries to bring people together, but the level and volume of public anger in Oman, as expressed on social media, including by senior state officials, has been really quite something over the past year. And so you do wonder if something fundamentally has changed, especially over anger at U.S. policy in terms of the war in Gaza and what this may mean going forward. It's certainly a barrier that has been shattered in terms of willingness to really criticize the US in very direct ways. And if you remember in 2016, what got Jamal Khashoggi in trouble, firstly, was because he offered a very mild criticism of Donald Trump when he won the election. And so to have moved on from that kind of very mild criticism to some of the full throated anger that is being directed at US and other policymakers over Gaza is just shows how far people have come in even just within 8 years.
No, absolutely. And taking all that into consideration, moving forward, how do you think the U.S. GCC corporation could either strengthen or either face challenges depending on which candidate wins the U.S. elections, and especially in terms of the broader global shifts in power economic focus?
Well, I think the GCC is in a better position in 2025 to deal with a potential Trump 2 than it was in 2017. And not just because I don't think a repeat of the Gulf crisis is likely, but also because over the past 5 years we've seen a more wider kind of spirit of reconciliation and sort of rapprochement, not just in the GCC, but with Iran and with Turkey as well. And ironically, a lot of that was triggered by Donald Trump inadvertently in 2019, choosing not to do anything when Saudi Arabia came under attack in September 2019 with the missile and drones that smashed into Abqaiq and Al Qudais. And 2 days later, Donald Trump stood up and said this was an attack on Saudi Arabia. It wasn't an attack on us. And I mean, until that point, I think the view in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and probably all other Gulf capitals was very much that an attack on the Gulf from an Iranian linked group was very much an attack on US interests. And Trump basically said, no, no, they're not. And so we almost saw straight away a very different mood begin to emerge, where the UAE directly reached out to Iran, the Saudis reached out indirectly, and we began to see a dialing down of the tensions almost straight away, to the extent that in January 2020, when Qasem Soleimani was assassinated, that we saw the Saudis actually sending Khalid bin Salman, the then deputy defense minister, to Washington to make the case in person for de-escalation. This was extraordinary in terms of the previous Saudi position towards Iran. The UAE was saying this is not the time for another conflict in the Gulf. And then, of course, in March 2023, we had seen a series of coordinated leaks to US media really saying that a Saudi-Israeli normalization deal was on the brink of happening. And actually, what happened the following day was a Saudi-Iranian normalization deal was announced in China, which took everybody by surprise. And so what we're seeing now, I think, is that leaders in the Gulf realize that they cannot go back to the kind of conflict of the last 15 years, certainly the 2010s. They need to focus on domestic issues. Mohammed bin Salman needs to deliver on the 2030 vision, on the giga projects. The UAE wants to stay ahead of the emerging competition from Saudi Arabia. Qatar's got its expansion of the LNG facilities for 2025, 27, and now even beyond as well. So, I mean, there's definitely no mood, I think, in the Gulf for a return to that post 2011 decade of instability. And so I think, regardless of who wins, they will have to absorb the new US leadership, but they will do so in a way that is very clear that we don't want to be dragged into another set of conflicts. This is not in our interest. It's not what we're looking for. You know, we need economic growth. We need regional stability. And of course, we've seen that since October 7th, with Saudi and Iran having regular high-level dialogue with officials traveling in both directions and making it very clear that any further escalation or regionalization of the war is in nobody's interests. And so that will be something that the new US administration, whoever takes charge and whoever is leading their Middle East policy, will have to take into account.
I think, as you elaborated, perhaps, in case Donald Trump wins, we can predict how the relationship might look like moving forward, but at the same time, he can also be a bit unpredictable. With Kamala Harris, as you mentioned earlier, she doesn't have a record in foreign policy. So I feel like, in this sense at least, a lot of us are tiptoeing around how things are going to look like, how the GCC states' relation with the US is going to look like, depending on her, I guess, definition or her direction with foreign policy, at least in terms of the GCC and oil economy. But at the same time, I feel like a lot of us are very anxious. We all have a lot of questions. I mean, this is a completely changed world. You did cover Gaza a little bit, a very, very crucial, important topic, even affecting the US elections with all the protests taking place here in the US. But in general, thank you so much, Dr. Ulrichsen. Thank you for having being our first guest in our podcast episode today. And really appreciate your time. If you have any points that we can wrap up discussion with, please feel free to mention them.
Well, no, thank you very much again for having me. I mean, we're now past Labor Day, so this is the sort of business end of the election over the next 2 months. And certainly, I think if Harris were to win, we can look at people like Phil Gordon, who is her senior foreign policy advisor, who I think can offer clues as to how a Middle East policy might evolve. But then also remember the fact that a year ago, Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, wrote an article in Foreign Affairs, I think it was, where he said the Middle East is quieter now than it has been for decades. And of course, that was about a week before October 7th happened. And so how the US looks at the Middle East is very different from how the Middle East looks at itself, I think. And I think what we've seen, especially over the past 11 months now, since October the 7th, is that there's a disconnect between DC and the region. And whoever becomes president will have to really focus on the aftermath of that disconnect, because that disconnect is very real and it's causing a lot of anger. And certainly, at least we won't have Biden 2. So there's a chance for a new approach, whether it's Trump 2 or Harris. But certainly trying to pick up the pieces and to repair some of the damage caused by very diverging views over what has happened over the last 11 months, I think will be a priority for, at least for the Gulf states, looking at the next occupant of the Oval Office, and perhaps for the new president, him or herself as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Ulrichsen. It was a pleasure to have you here with us. Thank you.
Thank